affirming a creator makes you a champion of equality and human rights. Every other thing evidently seems to make you an enemy of equality and human rights. It's that simple once again. Identity politics, on the other hand, eventually pits every person against every other person. That's the full flowering of standpoint theory. And that returns us to Hobbes' Leviathan, the war of all against all, which, as we saw earlier this morning, Hobbes described as life in this world as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And I don't think you mentioned this. What was Hobbes' solution to the fact that life is like that? Does anybody know? Central government. The establishment of central government. Sound familiar? That is why our time feels so intense right now. Divisiveness is everywhere and constant. What biological organism is meant to live under such circumstances? And that's the circumstances of our life today. We walk outside in the midst of infinite beauty. We come back home and met by a grandchild or your puppy or something. Your life is surrounded by infinite beauty, and the human social relations are, what did I call it? Was it divisiveness everywhere and constant? Even in our preschools, where kids should just be running in the sand and come back with a little bruise and get a little kiss on the elbow, or that's life. And yet in the name of what? Diversity. Oh, that sounds lovely. Equity. Lovely sounds lovely. And what? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. How much more lovely can you get? And you've created a society of absolute hell. Absolute hell. And insincerity and inability to even communicate. Under Marx, so we'll see how much worse wokeism is than earlier, simpler ideologies like Marxism. Marxism, the only people that needed to be exterminated were just capitalists and industrialists. They're just a small little group of people. Actually, a small group, the 1%. Actually, if you want to be a murderer, go back to being a Marxist. You have only very few people to take care of. Marxism killed over 100 million people, in just 70 years. I showed you this slide already. In just 70 years, with its focus, a tiny little group of people. Now, if woke completely flourishes, and now your enemy is not a tiny little group of people like industrialists or monarchs or clerics, tiny, and Marxism managed to kill over 100 million human beings in just 70 years, what are we going to do when everybody is an oppressor? When every single person alive by dint of your birth is in the oppression? And when people talk about depopulation, it's no small thing. Yes, this is the agenda of the WEF and the dehumanizing environmental tyranny. They say about 1.2 billion people is a good number of people to have on the earth. Anybody ever heard this? Anybody ever heard this? 1,000 people? 500,000. And what I say, 1.2 billion? I think I'll stick with my chances. No. Oh, on the Georgia Stones, no, but I'm talking about contemporary Harari. I'm talking about contemporary speaking philosophers that are speaking right now. People say, oh, that sounds about right. Look at the productivity of a farm. And yeah, but aren't there 8 billion people? Don't ask me about that. I'll get to you. This is a problem. Now attacking human identity has resulted in horrifying forms of self-hatred. And this is what David was talking about, the transgender movement. Because your identity is evil. How you were born is evil. And so now, in hostility to one's identity, people are carving themselves up into tiny little non-functional little pieces to try to deny their birth identity. The reason why the transgender movement is such an intense threat, it's the highest embodiment of adopting wokeism. If identity is the problem, then the transgender people are the full flourishing of the hatred of identity, even their own. The transsexual medical experimentation on people and children is the ultimate conquest of woke ideology. So I hope the seriousness of this battle begins to sink in, and how pressing it is for believers and people of conscience to find a path beyond the small differences among us and for its solidarity quickly. It's urgent. What can be done? I've only repeated, we've come to a wildly, an exponentially worse ideology, and I've only repeated the same thing. Declare a creator, say I'm created, and that the American founders had it right. Yes, that's true, had it right. Is that sufficient at this juncture now to win a battle in which we're at least 30 years behind? The fall of Marxism, like early 90s, right? Was this insight that I've identified twice in the earlier revolutions, is it sufficient now?